Great. Well, again, thank you everyone for coming. My name is John, and I did a research project on promoting engagement and enthusiasm in a middle school science classroom. So my question was, how can I create lessons that increase student engagement and buy-in in science class? I noticed that I had a lot of students who were kind of checked out and really weren't too involved, and there was this big disconnect between the students that were engaged and the students that were compliant. Compliance would be just students who were doing the work to get the work done. So for some context, I taught 7th grade science at Christopher McAuliffe Charter School in Framingham. Fairly diverse student backgrounds. I had a lot of ELL students, mostly from Brazilian families, but I also had a lot of white students and a couple black students as well. So what does engagement look like? For my purposes, I use this definition of engagement from Adam Fletcher, who is an author and an advocate for student engagement. And his definition is, students are engaged when they are attracted to their work, persist despite challenges and obstacles, and take visible delight in accomplishing their work. So you can contrast this with what I said about compliance, which is students just doing the work because they're told to do the work and they feel like they have to. So what's my rationale here? Many students seem to give up on science by the time they get to high school. So I felt that middle school was a crucial time to pull them in and get them interested in science and kind of make it feel relevant to them and something that they feel like they could continue doing even if they didn't want to be scientists when they grew up. So a basic understanding of science is really important, especially in today's world where you see a lot of backlash towards science in society, especially in this country today. And we have this whole concept now of fake news, and that's something that people need to be able to parse through. But even when you get to actual news, very rarely will you see a graph on the evening news that is actually representative of the data that they're trying to show. Or when, say the Today Show reports on a study, chances are they're misinterpreting it, and you need to be able to look at what they're saying and decide for yourself if that's real. Is what you're being told real? So this is about skills and getting involved in the scientific process. So my early observations showed me that students varied in engagement levels. Some were totally down and really ready to go and totally involved in whatever we had to do, and that was great. But then I also had students like this who were very vocal with their displeasure with the class. So one day I observed a student saying, "This is stupid, I don't understand why I need to know this, I'm not going to be a scientist." And that really kind of bugged me as a science teacher, because I don't expect all my students to love my class. I hope they do, but I hope they at least understand why it's valuable, why what we're learning is important. So my initial thoughts were that connecting content to students' experiences in their daily lives would be the key. That was the disconnect between what I felt was important about science and what they were frustrated with. They didn't see how it would help them. So I wanted to show students that science was relevant to their lives outside of the classroom. So I decided to create a survey, and I wanted to gauge their attitudes towards science. Not only how relevant they felt it was, but also how they felt engaged in science class in the past, and when they didn't feel engaged, also if they ever thought about being a scientist, who they thought could be a scientist. So I asked them if science was relevant, and almost 90% said that science could help them outside of school, and I was shocked, because given what I had heard in the classroom, I was positive that this was the problem, that they just didn't see how science could be helpful to them if they weren't going to be scientists. And the same number also disagreed with the statement, science doesn't really affect my life. So like some other people did, I tried to ask the same question 2 different ways, so they couldn't just say yes, 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 I agree to everything. And given these numbers, it was clear to me that this wasn't the issue, that unless they were deciding to tell me what they thought I wanted to hear, that they felt science could be relevant. So I had to go back and kind of figure out what I was going to do again. So luckily, I had asked them when they felt engaged in science class and when they felt least engaged. And as you can see here, they really don't like sitting around and listening and doing worksheets and reading and stuff like that. They want to be engaged. They want to do experiments. They want to do hands-on activities. They want to get up and go and do stuff. And I can't blame them. They're 11 and 12 years old. They're full of energy. They need to get going. So I thought about how I could design active lessons. So I started data collection with a new physics unit, which really lent itself to hands-on active lessons because we were doing motion and energy. So there were a lot of demonstrations that we could do and things that the kids could do themselves. So I recorded observations in my journal, noting what worked and what didn't day to day with different lessons. And I used these observations to inform my planning for the next day and the day after that. So what worked? There's a strong positive correlation between activity level and student engagement, but only up to a certain point. If the activity level got too high, then mostly the boys would just start going all over the place and using materials as weapons and running around, and it was chaos. So I realized I needed frequent check-ins and times to pause between the action so that they can reflect on what they were doing and maybe talk to each other or me about their observations. Students like talking about themselves. So I constantly had a problem before this with low participation in class discussions. Students didn't want to talk. Discussions tended to be dominated by 1, 2, 3 students who would raise their hand and then reluctantly keep raising their hand, and I didn't want to call on them over and over again, but no one else wanted to talk. But active lessons created a shared experience for these students, and they all wanted to talk about what they did, what their group did, what they saw, what they tried, what worked for them, what didn't work for them. And that ended up creating a much more egalitarian conversation environment where a lot more kids were volunteering. In fact, even that student who I quoted at the beginning saying that this is stupid, he started getting involved in conversations. And I once observed him high-five his friend for giving a right answer and get really excited about it. So this was good. So what? So they're excited, they're talking. So what? So work completion rose dramatically among my students who previously had lower work completion rates. So students like that student who was expressing his displeasure with science class at the beginning, he didn't always turn in his work, and when he did, it was generally not complete, very rushed. He just wanted to get it over with. That goes back to the compliance versus engagement difference. And so students like him started turning in their work on a much more regular basis, and it was much more thorough and complete. So the average quality of work rose among these students. Now the students who were already engaged, already doing really well in the class, I didn't see a whole big change in what they were turning in. But greater enthusiasm and less visible frustration was definitely evident throughout the whole class. So unfortunately I have some caveats here. Surveys are inherently unreliable, and like I said before, they could have just been telling me what they thought I wanted to hear when it came to how relevant things were to their lives. So I have to take that with a grain of salt, but I went with the assumption that they were telling the truth. It was the start of a new unit. So it was a new topic, and maybe they just like physics more than they like biology. I don't know. Maybe that's why they were so much more engaged. I can't really tell you. And also report cards had just gone home. So this greater work completion, higher quality work could have been a product of parents really kind of getting on them because they didn't do so well the last term. But parents at home can't really force kids to be engaged in the classroom. So the observations I made about that engagement, that was real. So to take this further, I think my next step would be to address some other survey questions I had, where over 3/4 said that they find science interesting, but almost 2/3 said they often found science class boring. So there's some kind of discrepancy here, some disconnect between their love of science or their appreciation of science and what's happening in class. And I think they think of science as black holes and dinosaurs and all this flashy cool stuff, but they don't think about the process that goes into making these discoveries, that goes into what scientists do on a day-to-day basis. And that's a lot of what science class is. It's this process, especially in middle school. It's the skills that they need to be scientists, to do their own inquiry.
didn't mention gender differences, and I don't know what the breakdown of the classroom was, but stereotypes would tell us that maybe, well, I don't know, we could go both ways. That one way you can think about it stereotypically is boys might be more engaged in science than girls. On the other hand, girls might tend to be the more compliant students who wish to please.
So my class was broken down pretty evenly, boys and girls, and as you can see with the 90% relevance, say 90% of students saying science was relevant to their lives, gender clearly wasn't a big deciding factor in that, because if 9 out of 10 kids in the class said that science was relevant to their lives, probably a pretty even breakdown of boys and girls. But as far as compliance versus engagement goes, girls tended to have already been turning in more complete, higher quality work, but it did, to me, seem a lot more compliant rather than engaged before I started this.
So John, I remember when I was visiting your classroom, I don't know how much you talked about the culture in which this was embedded, but I feel like that is really key. So maybe you can take a minute and talk about the charter school culture that you were in, and the particular culture of this classroom, against which, in many ways, you were working with this engagement versus compliance. Because I think if there are incoming students in the room to really think about the student-teacher's position in a culture that may be quite different than what they're trying to forward.
So McAuliffe is a really interesting place, and it's very community-oriented. Instead of a classic homeroom type thing, we have what are called crews, which would be like half a homeroom, and you have a lot of time getting to know the kids in your crew, and it's a little looser than I would be comfortable with, I think, having my own classroom from the start of the year. My mentor teacher was great. I loved working with him, but some of the things that were permitted in the school and the classroom were beyond what I felt was reasonable. But coming in and taking over the class halfway through the year, I couldn't really tell the kids, all right, these things that you've been able to do up until now, you can't do them anymore. So kids were able to kind of get up out of their seat, walk around, and movement breaks are fine, but there was this looseness to the classroom culture that was a little bit tough for me to deal with, and I think a lot of that contributed to some of the horsing around, the goofing off that emerged from these active lessons. Not to disparage Kristen McAuliffe Charter School, it's a great place, I love it. It's a very different environment than your average middle school.
Because I was hoping you could speak a little bit, because we have some incoming folks, about what does it mean to be a student teacher trying something new, trying to work toward engagement